Well, we're just letting everyone into the room, but why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another Faculty Friday. By now it's abundantly clear that climate change is upon us with huge impacts on the environment, the economy, human well-being. But is the climate emergency also a security threat? Climate change is poised to intensify resource competition and complicate issues around food security, spur mass migration, all of which are likely to lead to greater conflict. From the Asia Pacific and Latin America to the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, record temperatures, rising seas, and frequent extreme weather present significant challenges to human security. Joining me today to discuss the security risk of climate change is my colleague at the Korbel School, Cullen Hendrix. Cullen is Professor Hendrix is professor here at the Joseph Korbel School and also a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, senior research advisor at the Center for Climate and Security, a research professor at Hiroshima University in Japan, and a contributing author to the upcoming Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, their sixth assessment report. Professor Hendrix's research interests are quite broad. They include contentious politics, the political economy of development, and of course, environmental politics, particularly issues at the intersection of environment, food security, and conflict. His articles have appeared in journals ranging from Nature, Ecology and Society, Marine Policy and Global Environmental Change to the British Journal of Political Science, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research. That's a lot of places, Cullen, very impressive. And he also exemplifies our model of an engaged scholar. He works with a variety of practitioner organizations, the Asian Development Bank, the World Food Program, and he's called upon to advise policymakers often. So he's a perfect person to discuss this topic with today. Welcome to Faculty Friday, Cullen.
Thank you, Fritz. Lovely to be with you.
So as is our norm, we'll discuss between the two of us. I'll ask Cullen some questions and we'll have a conversation. But we will leave time for your questions from the audience. So put them in the Q&A in Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Cullen, let's start with the heart of the issue, the relationship between climate and security. You're really one of the world's experts on the relationship between climate change and security. Of course, that's not how most people think about climate change. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. It's clearly the defining environmental issue of our time. And we're quite aware of the economic impacts and increasingly some of the other impacts on health, migration, other dimensions. But it's only recently, at least that most people have been thinking about this as a security issue. You were actually an early mover in this space. You were one of the first people, I think, to really begin thinking about that. But why is this now emerging so much as a security issue?
It's a great question, Fritz. I'd like to actually start by reflecting on the Stern Report itself, because the Stern Report painted a very stark picture of some of the potentially staggering economic costs of climate change.
That's
not just for development.
2007 report, right?
So we're taking it back to 2007 and sort of the mid-aughts. And we've known for a long time, that the economic kinds of crises that climate change could portend often become political crises. So, again, reflecting on events in 2007 and into 2008, you had a global food price crisis that was caused in part by droughts in major exporting countries like Argentina and Australia. And that caused protests and rioting in about 50 different countries, mostly developing and middle-income countries, and including actually led to the ouster of several governments. So I think that was one of the kind of early linkages, the sense that there are these kind of climate-related events or extreme weather events that can have impacts on security outcomes and political stability throughout the world. And then I think that this was actually ramped up very significantly in 2010 and 2011 with the events of the Arab Spring, and in particular the events that took place in Syria. if you go back and reflect on earlier comments by President Obama and then Secretary Kerry, what you will see is that it came to be a very dominant part of the narrative around the Syrian civil war that had been catalyzed, at least in part, by a significant, say, 1 in a 5 to 9 century drought that had occurred in the Fertile Crescent. The story is obviously more complicated than that. The Syrian civil war is not about climate change per se, but it may have been kind of the spark that lit the tender. And I think that the broader security implications really came into relief when that conflict ultimately provoked or necessitated, depending on how you want to think about it, a response by several major powers, including the United States and Russia. So this was kind of the first time that a climate-linked kind of conflict had drawn in these kind of major actors in international security. There's also, I think, a deepening understanding of the climate crisis within the security community, especially over the last 10 years. And I want to, give a shout out to the Navy here in particular, because they were really early converts to taking climate science and climate change seriously, because it has direct implications for their basing and operating environments. 99% of their assets are within about a meter of sea level. If 99% of your assets are within a meter of sea level, then you definitely need to be thinking about the prospect of sea level rise. This isn't something that they can just kind of wish away. And, similarly, the United States Navy didn't feel like it could be caught off guard, in terms of new operating environments into which it might be moving, like say navigating the Arctic, which will become an increasingly kind of important hub of global sea trade as the polar ice sheets melt and that region becomes more navigable. And then I would say also that, the climate science and climate related social science have come a long way. 2 decades ago, our understanding of the links between climate change and conflict were really more predicated in science fiction than they were in science fact or hard social science. We've now got 2 decades of accumulated evidence that's painting, I think, a much clearer picture of the myriad security challenges that climate change poses. Climate change is going to affect the operating environments in which the US military finds itself, is going to affect the mission set. There's going to be increasing demand for search and rescue and humanitarian assistance, but then also support for beleaguered partner country governments, which are going to be facing a variety of threats to political stability and their incumbency related to the climate crisis and its effect on food and energy systems, its effect on migration patterns. It affects really everything moving forward. And so I've been lucky to spend my career thinking about, and contributing to that body of knowledge. And I think it's starting to become a bit more ripe now. So all of those things, I think, combined to make this really what's emerging as a front burner issue for the Biden administration.
Yeah. But you also, that great summary of how we got to this point where, at least in the military community and this community of scholars of whom you're a part, it's increasingly obvious that this is a security issue. But you in a recent essay you wrote for the wonderfully entitled "War on the Rocks" journal or website, you point out that climate change is not the normal kind of security threat. I think the metaphor you use is it's not the wolf at the door threatening to blow it down. It's more like termites who are quietly eating away at your house. And the implication is that it's it's true, say, for example, in Syria, that climate might have been a catalyst. It's not so obvious. It's somewhat more subtle. And these things are always multi-causal. So I guess my question to you, and you're right about this, is, in essence, how does that subtlety, that complexity, that difficulty of attributing any one event, dramatic event, to climate change, how does that affect our ability to respond to this problem?
Well, it affects it in a couple of different ways. I think that probably first and foremost, it affects it because, at least so far, climate change has not really manifested in terms of the kind of obvious, clear, and present danger that in the past has really reshaped the entire way of thinking about national security in the United States. Mm-hmm. So you have like a Pearl Harbor event, or even in our lifetimes, September 11th, right? Both of these events catalyzed a complete rethinking of national security architecture.
Right.
And really, in both instances, I think they necessitated or made the argument for a real reframing and reorientation of society around the need to sacrifice and invest in order to address these kinds of threats. Now, climate change hasn't emerged. It hasn't presented itself, as you mentioned before, as this kind of wolf at the door. And that's in part because even in a case like Syria, these are, like you said, they're multi-causal events. It probably mattered some, but it wasn't completely and uniquely determinative of the outcome.
Right.
And the kind of the best social science that we have kind of indicates that climate kind of matters a little bit across a lot of different conflicts. Now, that's fine and well, but when you're talking to a policy audience or you're talking to the general audience, what they want to know is, where did it matter a lot, right?
Yes,
What
yes,
is the example that I can
yeah.
point to orient myself around? And if we had, examples like that, and I think this is frankly one of the reasons why Syria was framed as such, if we had examples like that, it would probably motivate this kind of more security-oriented kind of thinking. And then the other piece of it is just the fact that, the multiplicity of channels via which climate change can affect security outcomes are just incredible. You can think about a variety of mechanisms just operating through the effects for global food systems. I know we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But if it matters, operating both through, say, effects for food systems, effects for human migration, effects for energy systems, effects for the economic prospects of developing countries, and the attendant, say, geopolitical competition between China and the United States for influence over those countries, it's coming through so many different pathways that it gets to be a little bit of a murky picture. And we're much better at dealing with clear pictures than murky ones.
Yeah. Well, let's try to. I want to get you in the weeds a little bit on these pathways, not to make it more murky, but I think it's helpful to kind of get a concrete sense of, how is it that climate affects food, affects security. For example, this is something you've written a lot on. So let's take that pathway, for example. When time permitting, we could explore some others. I'd be curious to know sort of which of them you think is most important. But I know the food pathway is a big one. The basic idea is that climate affects our food production systems, and this is a big deal, right?
Oh, it's a huge deal. I'd like to start just by saying that the COVID crisis, which is not necessarily what we're talking about today, has plunged potentially another 150 million people worldwide into food insecurity. And so that crisis is occurring against the backdrop of a real troubling increase in global hunger. And that global hunger is increasingly being concentrated in countries that are conflict affected, in part because of environmental stresses. So think about places like Northeast Nigeria, Iran conflict, which is also at least in part a response to a climate crisis in the region. And more broadly, hunger is on the increase because global food systems are not meeting demand, or at least meeting demand adequately enough that food prices are rising as well. And climate change is going to have incredibly diverse but almost uniformly negative consequences for agricultural systems and therefore agricultural livelihoods in the developing world. So take an issue that we talk about a lot in the United States, let's say the migration crisis. I'm sorry, I'm experiencing a gale force wind here.
Yes, you wanted to be in nature. I'm very impressed with the backdrop. It just so you know, we have a little bit of a static in the audio here, but we can hear you pretty well. But
great.
But this is, I think you're demonstrating the impacts of climate on, in this case, communication.
No, but in all seriousness, I do want to kind of reflect on this. To the extent that you think that migration, northward migration from Central America and Southern Mexico is a crisis, I don't happen to think it's a crisis, but it's certainly spinning into a political crisis, at least here in the United States. No. A lot of that is being catalyzed by just changes in the productivity of of agricultural systems. It's that you have people who have entire communities are built around, say, maize farming, for instance, so corn farming, have been for generations.
Yeah.
And because of increasing temperatures and changing and less predictable rainfall patterns, that livelihood is really, really, really going into retreat. And those folks are not going to simply stay where they are and suffer.
Yeah.
They're going to attempt to move to find better prospects. And that's just one way it might affect it. But then we can move out to the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that because of these negative effects from middle income and developing countries, especially around the equator, those countries are going to become even more reliant on the global food system. And the global food system is also going to become increasingly kind of concentrated in a few major exporting countries, especially ones at very high latitudes and low latitudes. Now, I wanted to get into the weeds on this, but let me just say this.
Yeah.
The Arab Spring component of that crisis that was fueled by a climate event was actually fueled by the imposition of significant export bans by the Russian government because they were trying to respond to their own concerns about their domestic food supply.
Yeah.
To the extent that it further kind of concentrates it in some of these major exporting countries. If you have a bad growing season like Russia or Canada or Argentina, that's going to reverberate even more and more in the global food system, causing price spikes and bringing people out into the streets to demand that the governments do something.
Let's pick, so clearly the food production system, food security, the impact on migration, other geopolitical impacts, all lead to potential security. You have potential security implications. I mean, as you point out, there's so many pathways. There's through which climate affects ultimately security, human security. If you were to pick a couple of the others, I know you've written on fisheries, you've written on a whole host of things. You mentioned, even the impact on, as we move to a greener economy, we increase demand for lithium and cobalt and other rare metals, and that has implications. If you were to pick a couple of other pathways that you'd sort of say, these are the things we really ought to keep our eye on, what would they be?
I'll focus on the one that I think about a lot, and then I'll tell you the one that's starting to give me nightmares. The one I think a lot about is the transition that's coming in global energy systems, which is going to be important if we're ever going to get carbon emissions mitigated and reduced so that we can stop contributing to the mounting problem. Now, that's going to have two different sets of security implications. On the one hand, it's going to make the world less dependent on oil, but it's also going to cut into the revenues that are the source of political stability in many oil exporting countries, right? So you're going to be staring at a future where countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, and Russia, for that matter, have a lot of sunk and wasting assets that are in the ground, and that's going to cause, I think, problems on the domestic front. On the other hand, it's going to rapidly increase demand for these kind of what are referred to as transition methods. So some of the exotic ones that you mentioned, stuff that goes, electric car batteries, but also some more basic, kind of stuff that's been with us a long time, like copper, aluminum, things like that. That matters because it's going to potentially lead to a new scramble for resources, similar to the scramble we saw for oil resources in the 20th century. And many of the countries that have large endowments of these resources are not particularly politically stable places with already significant insecurity, like Eastern Congo. And so that's just the energy kind of piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And then the one that gives me, the one that's starting to keep me up at night is one that Rod Schoonover, his friend, and used to be the top climate security analyst within the U.S. government on the intelligence side, kind of turned me on to, and that's the increased frequency of zoonotic transmission. And zoonotic transmission just means diseases coming from animals into human populations. That's how we got the coronavirus. That's how we think we got the coronavirus. And to the extent that that begins occurring much more frequently, you don't just have this kind of more conventional security kind of oriented kind of potential crises. you have the potential for this kind of COVID crisis to be a recurrent crisis that occurs increasingly frequently. So sorry, I know it's going to make it difficult for some of you to eat your lunch and sleep at night. On the horizon.
And it would be easy to kind of spin out other pathways, other things to worry about. Let me turn the conversation a bit though to the policy implications. So the question then becomes, all right, given that there are very important security dimensions to climate change, what does that understanding, how does that understanding inform policy choices? I mean, obviously it makes it ever more important that we try to mitigate, reduce the magnitude of climate change. But I wonder if you could give some specific examples of ways in which, as in your own work, as you've thought about these issues, they actually suggest rather more specific interventions, the ways in which it could either mitigate or adapt to the changes and therefore reduce the security implications.
Yeah, well, I think the first step to getting the policy right in any policy area is getting the right people in position to craft it and to implement it. And so thinking about that from, say, the perspective of, say, the U.S. Department of Defense, I think that the Biden administration has done an excellent job of doing that. The Biden administration is far and away the administration that is grappling with these issues and most seriously and dedicating real human and material assets to addressing the issue. So, your number 2 and number 3 people in the Pentagon, Kathleen Hicks and now Colin Kahl, are both folks who kind of have religion on climate change as a security issue, which is something we couldn't say about previous administrations. And interestingly enough, actually, Colin Kahl, who many of you, if you recognize the name, you recognize it because his stance on Iran, his contentious Senate confirmation hearing, and the fact that he and his wife were the target of an intelligence operation they got targeted by Black Cube, an Israeli firm that was working ostensibly for the Trump administration. He was one of the early contributors here. I like to say that I got in on the ground floor, but I didn't. I really probably got into the space on, say, the second floor. Colin Kahl was on the first floor, writing about this in the late 90s in the mid 2000s. That's the third person at the U.S. Department of Defense, and he's going to be in a really important position to guide kind of the crafting of actual policy in this space. So, having the right people on the team is the first step. In terms of specific interventions, I think we're going to be, I guess I'll focus on one that I think is kind of domestic here in the United States, and the other one is going to be more focused about abroad. On the home front, we really need to reorganize the way that the National Security Council operates. They're going to need to increasingly bring in voices from, say, not traditional security voices, people from the Department of the Interior, the Department of Agriculture, which is tasked with fighting forest fires on public lands. If a foreign enemy, right, had managed to set half the Western United States on fire, you can be damn sure that something would have been done about it, something kinetic. And it would be that the policy response would have been backed up by the most fearsome array of military assets the world has ever known. It turns out, though, for addressing a lot of the kind of threats that climate change poses, SEAL Team 6, the nuclear triad, the Fifth Fleet aren't necessarily the right tools. But Interior and Agriculture may have them. Now, I think that it's also going to affect provisioning within the military. So they, especially during the Iraq War, they came to realize that these supply and logistics chains that had them trucking gasoline and jet fuel around Iraq made them extremely vulnerable. And that to the extent that they can begin introducing renewables and more solar energy into the military's material, that's going to lessen, it's going to enhance, their ability to protect their own forces, but it's also going to lower the military's footprint in terms of carbon and other emissions. And then thinking about what this means for our partnerships, especially with developing countries. this last, or actually 2 weeks ago now, I released a brief that I wrote for USA in collaboration with someone in their Office of Food Security and Resilience. And it's really clear to me that the United States is going to have to massively development assistance targeted at the agricultural sector, but also targeted at diversification in countries that are experiencing chronic food insecurity. And many of them are actually already experiencing conflict as well. So think about environments like Nigeria, or even think closer to home, a very fragile context like Honduras. If we don't figure out how to put the resources in the field to help make their existing agricultural systems more resilient to climate change, or help people have other meaningful prospects for livelihoods, it's going to necessitate much more conventional security. It's something I don't think anybody wants as a first choice solution for the problem. And then, everything on the mitigation side, rejoining the Paris Agreement was a great start. Announcing a national, our national contributions, making these very, very, very ambitious targets, and then really putting some proposed money, trillions of dollars of money behind kind of catalyzing changes in energy systems and really getting us weaned off of fossil fuels. Now, obviously, all of that has to work its way through political process. And this is where your expertise would come in more handy. So maybe I want to kick back to you and say, what do you think of the prospects that this kind of Green New Deal-esque large spending package is going to make it, to the president's desk?
So thanks for turning the question back on me. I mean, that's and a hard one because the politics of this are complicated. I mean, obviously the Biden administration is, as you were saying, is taking this all of government approach, is really mainstreaming climate throughout the whole executive branch, and there's a lot they can do outside of legislative action. Legislative action remains difficult, though. I think we're going to get some version of the Jobs Infrastructure Act. I think there's a pretty good chance, maybe not all of it, and there are good pieces of that are really quite green, that really are intended to spur renewables, for example. More dramatic things, a generation ago now, we came close to a cap and trade program in the early first year and a half of the Obama administration, but that's not really likely in the cards given the current composition of the Senate. So the jury is out in terms of how big they'll be able to go on anything that requires significant legislative action. But as you were saying, there are so many things across all the other agencies of government in the executive branch that they'll be able to do quite a bit, I think. And it is, as you noted, I mean, it's a sea change, really. I mean, it wasn't just the Trump administration that didn't pay attention to this. Really, in fairness, it wasn't a priority for previous administrations either. And it's quite, at least rhetorically now, and I think as you're pointing out in terms of the selection of people and some of the actions we've seen, it is in fact a centerpiece of this administration's foreign and domestic policy. So it's a pretty dynamic moment. You'd give them, what would you give them if I made you give them a grade right now? I mean, rhetorically, it's a centerpiece. How real is this as in fact the climate at the center of American foreign policy?
I would say I give the Biden administration, I think, and thank you for kind of clearly kind of laying out, the kind of the difficulties that may lie ahead because of the arduous politics of getting things through the House of Representatives and the Senate, especially since it seems like we're already, back in an election cycle in terms of the House side, right?
Yeah.
So the picture could change a lot in the next few years. If I'm grading right now, if I'm giving them a midterm evaluation, subject to change, I'll give the administration, I'd say, an A. And that's, I don't know if I'm grading on the curve, but I am taking into account the fact, even though you have ostensibly unified government, you've got some pretty razor thin kind of margins. And that because of that, they're going to be a little circumscribed in what they can do here. But, stepping away from just kind of the nuts and bolts kind of policy and the minutia on this, it's really important that the Biden administration so quickly jumped back into the Paris Agreement, because the United States lost a lot of credibility in terms of its ability to provide any kind of leadership in addressing the climate crisis. And to the extent that the world's largest or second largest economy, depending on how you kind of crunch the numbers, is not participating in a global compact to try to address climate change, that discourages a lot of others from wanting to participate. Because if the big economies are not going to get involved, or at least one of them is going to sit it out, then why should they change? And so the demonstration effect, I think, there is huge. And that's not just related to climate policy. The Biden administration has clearly, getting back to security policy, is spending the lion's share of its time getting its people around to try and shore up traditional alliances, talking to NATO, talking to Japan, talking to Korea, making those very high priority. And, that's important. But unfortunately, it seems like we're finding that the US president is only as credible as the Congress can let them be. So I'm a little concerned if we're grading, 6 months to a year from now, the problem will be that there was a lot of nice rhetoric, and that there's a lot going on behind the scenes in the executive offices and in the various at the cabinet level, that there won't be this kind of catalytic kind of expenditure, this kind of Green New Deal that will really help, further, cement progress in this area. And, not for nothing, I'm sorry, I reminded me of something that you and Senator Bennett and I were talking about last fall, when we had an event talking about kind of the importance of U.S. leadership on the green economy. If the United States sits out, this round of massive expenditures and investments that China and the European Union are poised to make, it will lose leadership on these issues permanently, and it will also lose economic competitiveness, which is ultimately a security issue as well. So we'll see.
Yeah, and I think that's one aspect of it that it has a good chance of bipartisan support for all the reasons that you can imagine. You're talking about the U.S. rejoining the Paris Accords and the sort of international processes. Let me use that to segue to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that you are part of. International process has been going on a long time that brings together the world's experts to make assessments periodically. And you're part of that process. So maybe you could say a few words. I don't know if everyone in the audience knows what the IPCC process is, but maybe you could say a few more words about what that is and what your role in that is.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So climate scientists were pretty prescient in realizing a long time ago, several decades ago, that understanding change at a global scale is really difficult for people to wrap their heads around. It's difficult for the scientists to wrap their heads around. And furthermore, I think they also realize that scientists spend a lot of time debating with one another, right? We love to argue with one another. We love to challenge findings that are in the field. And from a kind of a public, policy-oriented communication perspective, that's kind of problematic. You and I might agree on 98% of the facts under discussion, but if we're academics, we're going to debate to death the 2% over which we don't agree. And so there was this recognition that across not just the social sciences, but even more so in the natural sciences, they needed to get on the same page and say, okay, what can we say to the world that we conclusively know? And they didn't say anything conclusively, but they say with a higher degree of certainty or low degree of certainty, what do we know about the impact of, say, global warming on coral reefs? What do we know about the impact on, food production systems in Western Africa? And it turns out that every 7 years or so, they get the global scientific community. It's thousands and thousands of scientists from virtually every country on Earth who are contributing to this thing. And they get together and they integrate the knowledge that they have so that we can produce these massive reports that are then, sort of gone through with a fine-tooth comb over and over and over again, to then say to the world, here's what we think we know. And we always say what we think we know because it turns out that the quest for knowledge is never ending. And my part in that process is directly related to what we're talking about today. So I'm working on one of the elements, which is something called a representative key risk, which is just looking across the landscape and saying, what are some of the issue areas that we think are the most pressing for policymakers to be thinking about? And my part in that is kind of synthesizing along with a Norwegian scientist, a scientist from India, and a scientist from Belgium, the state of knowledge about the kind of relative threats to peace and human security. And so, when that work is all done, I will just be kind of one drop in the scientific ocean, but I'll at least be able to say I did my part this time around.
Yeah, and it must be a fascinating process to be a part of.
It really is, because you're having these kind of conversations that are bringing together essentially physicists, the really smart folks who created all of these global circulation models that are the whole reason why we think we can anticipate what Colorado's climate will be like in 80 years from now. You get those people in dialogue with anthropologists who are studying migration. You get those people involved with the folks who are working on enhancing, say, the resilience of urban infrastructure to issues like flooding. So catalyzed by events like the Houston flood from a few years back. And so it really, unfortunately, it's taking place in the virtual space. But if anything, actually, that's made it easier for us to meet more frequently, more dialogue, and certainly has been good in leveling the playing field so that more scientists from kind of the less developed countries are able to participate on an equal playing field. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, and it's I think it's often easy to be cynical about these international processes, UN processes, other processes, especially that lead to reports. But this is one that, at least my observation is that it has, because it's designed the way it is, it has a kind of gravitas as a kind of reference that many policymakers, activists, others can refer to, and this not only has the state of knowledge improved over time, but I think gradually, at least, that is now percolating out into publics, and so great that you're part of that, and terrific. Let me tell you to our audience, we're going to open up for questions in just a second here. Let me ask. One more question that's a little unrelated, actually, but I think it was just last week, wasn't it, that you hosted and led a Responsible Engagement Institute here at the Korbel School, along with a number of our other colleagues who were quite involved in this project funded by the Carnegie Corporation. And as you've been talking, and I think I said in the introduction, you exemplify the kind of work I think a lot of us here at the Korbel School try to do, which is to do research that has direct relevance and to be engaged with policymakers and the like. But with that engagement comes a kind of responsibility that maybe one doesn't have if you're doing more esoteric work and somewhat more removed from the policy world. So. This, as I understand, this institute and this project is really around what is the nature of that responsibility and what are the ethical considerations. And I wonder if you could. I so enjoyed the limited time I was able to spend with you and colleagues on that. But I wonder if you could say a few words about that, because I think it's indicative of the kind of work that we're doing at the Korbel School. Our focus on engaged scholarship, and now. Certainly through this process on the ethical dimensions of that.
Well, I think, Fritz, I'd start just by saying that I think that you and I share the belief that the work that we do, the knowledge that we create, should be useful to society. Esoteric work is fine, but I didn't wind up at a place like the Korbel School because I wanted to sit on the sidelines, so to speak. I wanted to be contributing that hopefully could inform better policymaking in a variety of arenas. And I've been very fortunate to get to interact with a lot of policy communities to do that, including the U.S. national security community. But when I do that, right, I think you have a great kind of way of putting this. I think it was put to you by your mentor. Okay, you develop all this knowledge. Be careful what you say, because someday somebody's actually going to listen to you. That knowledge that we have is an immense source of power and standing with not just society, but with these kind of policy practitioner communities. And that means that we need to be thoughtful about how it is that we go about engaging, so that we are, I think that you could almost, I think my colleague George Martino would say we need something similar to the Hippocratic Oath. When engaging with policy audiences, first kind of do harm. And international relations scholars do a lot of this. We did some survey work on IR eggheads, and we found out that engaging with policy audiences is by far the norm, not the exception.
Yep.
And I think we've done that relatively successfully in terms of getting into the room. But once we're there, how do we engage in ways that effectively can say communicate nuance? How do we engage in ways so that our work is not misconstrued and or intentionally misrepresented, right?
Yeah.
If you go in and paint a picture of the starry night, you don't want them turning it into a sunny day by just focusing on the moon. And that's just an example of kind of one of the small problems that we face. And I had to learn those lessons through basically the school of hard knocks. The only reason I think that myself and several of the other instructors there, the only reason we had anything to teach or to offer was because we had to learn these lessons the hard way. And we thought that a really important component of making things better or easier or more responsible moving forward was to provide a space where early career academics, so think PhD students, postdoctoral researchers, people on their first couple of years on the tenure track, could get together and really discuss these kind of dilemmas that can arise. Because these are things that are part of the hidden syllabus. There's a lot of talk about hidden syllabus. This is not something that your mentors in graduate school are likely to talk much about. Now, that may have been different in your career, but we were just happy to be able to convene that space, and we were thrilled that the Carnegie Corporation was interested in supporting that work, and indeed they've already issued a second tranche funding that's going to continue that work, primarily led by two of my colleagues, Deborah Avant, who's the director of the C Center for International Security and Diplomacy, and Nazneen Barma, who's the director of the Scrivener Institute. Have you spoken to both of them in this series yet?
We've I'm going down, and I have not yet. So Naz and I've had occasion to talk. So, but Debbie and I have not. So we'll. Okay. They're on the. She's on the list.
Good.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you. For that. We could talk more. I just think it's terrifically important. Both, as you say, the focus on doing work that matters and that has impulse, it has impact, and that's very much the flavor of what I think draws all of us to the Korbel School. But then with it, as you say, comes the possibility that someone might actually listen to your advice, and there could be unintended consequences or other misuses of your work, and how to think about that. It's very important. Anyway, thanks for sharing that and all you've shared with us. Let me turn now to questions from our audience. I have first up Melissa Schambach. Hi, Melissa. As she writes, as the military becomes increasingly focused on the security threats posed by climate change, how appropriate is the securitization of climate issues, the mobilization of military personnel and resources to address the climate crisis? How involved should the military be or not be?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not surprised it's a great question because it comes from a great source. And Melissa Schambach is a former Korbel student. And we're very, very, very proud of her. Incredibly bright young woman. So hi, Melissa. Glad to see that you're here. I'm going to kind of crib from a friend of mine, Frank Femia, who is one of the founders of the Center for Climate and Security, which you mentioned earlier, and say that securitization is not the same thing as militarization. Addressing climate change as a security issue isn't just about reorienting existing military assets or taking resources and tasking the military to dealing with those. It's also about taking a much more kind of holistic perspective, the kind of which I mentioned earlier, about bringing voices that are not military, but that nevertheless are voices that are dramatically important for, say, U.S. National security and human security, not just in the United States, but throughout. The COVID crisis, I think, has done a lot to make people aware of the fact that some of the most significant threats to humanity, but also to the United States, do not come in the form of an armed actor carrying a gun, right? And so I think that the security, discussing climate change as a security issue is, I think it's acknowledging reality. And I think it's also not the same as saying all of this problem, taking a complex problem and saying, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about it like it's a nail because we've got this great hammer, right, which is the U.S. Armed Forces. I don't think that that's the appropriate lens on it. I will say that there's always that temptation, though, and this is something I've had to think about a lot in my career. This actually relates to the responsible engagement question. You know, am I overly securitizing this? Am I talking about this in a way that strips the issue from, keeping the focus primarily on the environmental implications or the human security implications, right? Not just worrying about what the U.S. military is going to do, but thinking more about how this affects people the world over and their access to livelihoods and food. But I've kind of come to the position that there, regardless of whether or not I'm advocating for them, it's already clear that significant security implications, some of which have necessitated or at least elicited armed responses, are already here. So I think that my task is to try, and the task of people like me more broadly, is to simply try and put that in a context perspective that's respecting the actual state of knowledge that we have around the time.
That's great.
I really messed up by teaching Melissa about securitization theory. She may have picked it up from some other people as well. I set my own trap.
Good question, Melissa. Our colleague Xusheng Zhao writes, you said that the Biden administration has rallied U.S. allies in Europe and Asia to join hands in fighting climate change, but the administration has also rallied them in the contest with China on other security and human rights fronts. A Japanese colleague said that China is more of a threat to them than climate change. How can the U.S. reconcile the threats from climate change with other threats, working with allies, and find ways to compete and cooperate with China?
Sam, that's a great question. I think that there's been recognition, at least for several decades, that on the mitigation side, China and the United States are clearly the two most important actors that need to be at the table and need to be coordinating policy responses, mitigation strategies, if we're going to get anything significant done to decrease carbon emissions. But you raise a really important point in the sense that it's going to be difficult for the United States. I guess I want to push back on this idea that the United States is in a purely competitive relationship with China in terms of thinking about kind of climate change and responses. And part of that is related to the simple fact that we've never really had a situation like this before, where you have two countries that are ostensibly security rivals who are economically integrated to this great extent. And China is incredibly important for fueling, I think, the energy transition in the United States. It's one of the things that is making it very complicated for the world to engage with China on the Xinjiang issue, is because Xinjiang's the source of about 50% of the global supply of refined silica, which is the stuff that we need to make solar panels in the first place. So if the United States were to take a completely adversarial kind of stance towards China on issues related to climate change and the security realm more broadly, I think that it would actually harm the ability to really do anything coherent. I simply just don't think it's a viable strategy as integrated as the two countries' economies have become. That process was kind of reversed a little bit during the Trump administration, and Biden certainly seems more protectionist than any, I think, Democrat in at least recent memory. But I'm hoping that relationship can get a little bit better there. In terms of the relationship with the allies, I would take, especially in the Asia Pacific, I interpreted that as being a little bit more related to sort of Korea's concerns about North Korea, and then kind of the issue related to competition in the South China Sea, and those are thorny issues, and competition over, say, fisheries resources is a pretty significant source of friction between China and some of its regional neighbors in the Southeast China Seas. So yeah, Sam, I wish I had a more coherent answer, but I think you could get the entire sort of national security apparatus and all of the combined knowledge in the space into a room, and I think that they would fail to come up with a coherent way of thinking about this.
It's a big challenge. I should advertise Professor Zhao will be moderating a discussion on the U.S.-China nexus on climate change in I believe it's next week on that topic. Let's see if we can get a couple other questions in quickly. So Adam Siegel asks, which military/educational institution is doing well when it comes to discussing teaching climate change and climate security implications? And why do you think so?
Okay, so who's doing a good job of talking about this? I mean, I'm thinking, let me look at, I just want to look at that question a little bit more closely just to make sure I'm answering this.
Yeah.
I think I would probably say the Naval Academy. I think the U.S. Air, so pitching Colorado here, I think the Air Force is interested in this as well, because simply by virtue of the fact that it has an incredible amount of meteorological expertise that's associated with the Air Force. In terms of, I guess I would say, programs that feed a lot of people into the defense community, but are not necessarily based in service institutions, I would say, I think that I like to think the Korbel School does a pretty good job of this. And I think that George Washington University has a very strong program in this. Hate to pitch some of our rivals or competitors, but credit where credit is due. Marcus King has a great program there. And, I wish I had a more concrete answer for you, but the simple fact of the matter is, if you'd gone to graduate school 10 years ago, a course like the climate security course I teach and the environmental security course that I teach might not even be on the syllabus. So, this is still an emerging area, and for those who are thinking about investing in our future capacity, including the person sitting in front of me in the virtual space, this is an area where there's a lot of opportunity for educational institutions to make a significant mark here, because this issue is not going away.
Thanks, Cullen. And we'll turn a couple of questions on politics. One is from Jackson Burrow. Do you think that emphasizing the aspects of climate crisis that security risks involved with it is an effective way to convince conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, or conservative House Dems that are already worried about 2022? Is this an effective way to get Democrats on board with the scale of spending necessary, so the Green New Deal, whatever form that might take?
Well, being flippant, I imagine that getting a new National Climate Research Center in Arizona or a National Infrastructure Institute in West Virginia would probably be pretty helpful to getting them on board. So, Fritz, you obviously know how this kind of work gets done. So there's probably some pork that's going to have to be spread around. Some bread's going to need to get buttered there. But more seriously, I think it does, in part because in this space, and I think Center for Climate Security has been really effective here, policymakers pay attention when the folks with the brass on their chest start talking about these kinds of issues. And the U.S. National security community in the military has really gotten on board. Lots of former generals, lots of former admirals are speaking out very, very actively about this. And I think it really is doing a lot to reshape the understanding of the issue amongst Democrats who are, like Manchin with the coal-based economy in West Virginia, who are in a pretty difficult political position for taking on climate change, purely as an environmental issue. This at least it gives them, in addition to being a real threat, it also gives them a little bit of cover they wouldn't have had otherwise to get on board for one of these large spending initiatives. Fritz, you're better on this kind of stuff than I am. What do you think?
Well, the politics of this are complicated. I guess I think that it's a good question because I think historically security has been used, certainly in the Cold War context, to justify spending on education and a host of other things. So I do think it's as it were, a winner politically. And so the extent to which the security dimensions can become crystallized and clearer, it probably is helpful. I no longer work in the Senate, and so I'm not as close to it as I once was, but that'd be my impulse. We were just about really out of time. Let me actually just close with a question from our colleague Irene Wygant, who says a more general question, really. She's a parent, and I can relate to this as a recent grandparent. We think about the environmental issues and environmental security, all the issues you're talking about, and their implications for, our children and future generations. It's kind of frightening, she says, terrifying, really. But I guess this is a glass half full or half empty kind of question, but what's your big take? What's your greatest hope for the next generation on this?
It's going to be funny because I think a lot of people would come away from this discussion thinking I'm a pessimist, but actually I'm very optimistic about the future. The history of humanity is really fundamentally the history of addressing challenges coming from our natural environment, and now increasingly challenges that are coming from our effects on our environment. If you were to buy the human ingenuity couldn't get us out of something like what's known as the Malthusian trap, right? Like too many mouths chasing too little food. That's an argument that's been around since the 18th century, and it turns out that we've got a great 3-century run here of meeting these challenges because of the one really inexhaustible resource that we have, which is human ingenuity. And I think because of that, and because as an educational institution, I get to spend a lot of my time with some of the best brass of the next generation, I have a lot of faith in that. I don't know if my generation will solve these problems, and fundamentally they're not solvable. This is always going to be a challenge. There's going to be no victory over climate change today. But I'm bullish on the people who are going to be carrying that fight and for addressing that challenge in the future.
Well, we're out of time, but that is a great note to end on. I share your optimism about our capacity as humans to solve problems when we're confronted with them. Thanks so much, Cullen, for being with us today, for all your insights and all your great work in this space. And let me thank all of you in the audience for joining us. This is the last Faculty Friday of the school year, but we'll be back again in September with more of our fabulous faculty here at the Korbel School. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great day and a great weekend, all.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.